why it mattered so much. I am 72 years old, a woman who spent her life raising children, cooking meals, and holding a family together even when no one else tried. For years, I worked quietly, sometimes as a seamstress, sometimes helping neighbors with errands, and always saving every little coin as though it had wings. Life was never luxurious, but it was honest. And in all those years, I learned that what makes a house a home is not the furniture or the walls, it's the people who fill it with love. And yet, on Christmas Eve, I found myself surrounded by everything but love. My children had better parties to attend, better people to impress, better places to be. They called it busyness, but I knew it was something else, indifference. I was no longer at the center of their world. I was a shadow on the edges, convenient when they wanted comfort, disposable when they didn't. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't throw accusations, because what they didn't know, what they couldn't even imagine, was that the same woman they had dismissed as fragile and forgettable carried a truth that could shake their very view of me. Weeks earlier, I had bought a simple ticket at the corner store, just as I'd done a dozen times before. Most people laugh at those tickets, calling them foolish, but that night, fortune smiled on me. I didn't just win a small prize. I won enough to change the story of my life. Enough to make silence my greatest weapon. Enough to make absence the very stage on which I would rise. That night, sitting alone with my hands resting on the tablecloth, I understood something I had never dared to face. Sometimes, the people we love most reveal their truth not in grand betrayals but in the tiny choices they make, like leaving an old woman to eat Christmas dinner alone. And so, I stayed quiet. I let the loneliness pierce me, but I also let it sharpen me, because I knew one day soon, when the truth came out, they would realize that the woman they abandoned at Christmas was the same woman who had bought the very block they walked on. If stories like this matter to you, tap like and subscribe. It helps this reach someone who needs courage tonight. Tell me, when help looks like absence, when family feels more like strangers, would you notice the difference before it's too late? The days leading up to Christmas had already carried their silent cruelties. At first, I thought the little things didn't matter, the unanswered calls, the quick excuses, the "we'll stop by later" mom promises that never came true. But those tiny fractures grew until they became a canyon I could no longer cross. My phone sat on the table like an ornament that no one cared to touch. The tree twinkled in the corner, but its lights reflected only my face, never theirs. I remember baking cookies the week before, the same way I had done every December for decades. Cinnamon, ginger, vanilla, the scents that once brought my children running to the kitchen with laughter in their voices. This time, the cookies cooled untouched. I wrapped them neatly in tins, placed ribbons on the lids, and waited for someone to come by. No one did. The tins stayed stacked on the counter, each one a silent reminder that my efforts no longer meant anything to the people I had given everything to. On Christmas Eve morning, I set the table as I always had. White cloth, polished cutlery, crystal glasses saved for special occasions. I roasted a chicken smaller than the turkeys I used to make when the house overflowed with relatives, but still seasoned with love. I lit candles. I poured cider. And then I sat, waiting for the knock at the door that never came. Hours stretched into silence, the food growing colder with each tick of the clock. Outside, I could hear the laughter of neighbors, families clinking glasses, children squealing with delight. Inside, I was an island of one, stranded in a sea of memories. When the phone finally rang, my heart leapt. I thought, they're on their way. But it was only my daughter's voice, distant and hurried. "Sorry, Mom. The kids wanted to stay at their friends'. We'll see you tomorrow." Tomorrow never came. Another call, this one from my son. "Things are crazy here, Mom. You understand. We'll make it up to you." The words "make it up to you" tasted like dust. You can't make up for absence. You can't wrap an empty chair with ribbon and call it love. As the night fell, I pushed the plates aside and sat in the stillness. The house, once alive with carols and chatter, felt like a museum of ghosts. Every ornament on the tree told a story: a clay star made by my daughter in kindergarten, a glass ball from my husband before he passed, a wooden soldier my son once hung proudly when he was small. Those ornaments were witnesses to a time when family meant something. Now they mocked me with their silence. The micro-humiliations stacked like bricks. A text message with a half-hearted Merry Christmas instead of a visit. A gift card slipped under the door instead of a hug. The assumption that I would be fine alone because I was always strong. They didn't see me. Not really. They saw only the shell of me. The woman who would wait no matter how long, who would accept whatever scraps of attention were thrown her way. But I felt the sting in every gesture. The neighbor across the street waved as his family spilled into cars headed to midnight mass. I waved back, pretending I wasn't choking on envy. Another neighbor left a plate of cookies on my porch, not knowing I had baked dozens of my own that sat untouched. Even strangers seemed to have more room for kindness than my own blood. I tried to distract myself by flipping through old albums, photos of birthdays, vacations, holidays filled with smiles. In one picture, my son had frosting on his nose, laughing as he leaned toward me. In another, my daughter clung to my arm, eyes bright with joy. Those children were gone. What remained were adults too busy, too self-absorbed, too indifferent to remember the woman who had sacrificed everything for them. And yet, the greatest humiliation wasn't their absence. It was the way they made me feel invisible while I was still here. As though I were already a ghost, someone to be visited out of duty, not love. I realized I had become a placeholder, not a person. But as I sat there, bitterness gnawing at my chest, I also felt a spark flicker. They thought their absence had diminished me. They thought leaving me alone at Christmas proved I had no value. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't even dream, was that I held something greater than their neglect. A secret that would turn every act of indifference into fuel for my transformation. So I waited. I let the silence soak into me. Let the humiliation carve deep lines into my heart. Because I knew one day, when the truth emerged, those very wounds would become the sharpest mirrors, reflecting back the ugliness of their choices. Tell me, have you ever been left behind by the very people you loved most, only to realize that their absence revealed more about them than it did about you? As the hours of Christmas Eve crawled by, I realized something important. Pain sharpens memory. Every laugh I didn't hear from my children, every knock that never came to my door, every plate of food that grew colder on the table, they all pressed me to remember the truth I had been carrying in silence. A truth they didn't know, because I had chosen to guard it like a flame hidden in the dark. Weeks earlier, I had stood in line at the corner store. My cart held flour, milk, a few vegetables, nothing fancy. I had just enough tucked away to manage the bills, to stretch meals into something resembling feasts. On a whim, almost as if the universe nudged me, I handed the cashier $1 for a ticket. I didn't expect much. I never did. My life had never been shaped by luck but by labor, sweat, and sacrifice. Yet, that night, when I scratched away the silver coating, my eyes widened. I blinked again, thinking I had misread the numbers. But the truth stood bold and undeniable. I had won. Not a small prize, not a handful of bills. Enough to change my life, enough to rewrite the way the world had treated me. At first, I sat in silence with the ticket pressed against my chest. Fear and disbelief tangled inside me. Could this be real? Was it a cruel trick? I checked the numbers again and again. The confirmation came later, in a sterile office, where a man in a suit smiled at me with practiced charm and slid papers across the table. "Congratulations," he said, but the word didn't sound real. All I felt was the thrum of my heart, a mixture of dread and possibility. I left that office with more than just money. I left with a choice. For the first time in decades, my life wasn't dictated by scarcity or compromise. I didn't have to count pennies at the grocery store, didn't have to pray that my roof would last another winter, didn't have to accept crumbs when I deserved a seat at the table. I carried in my hands a freedom no one suspected. But I also knew what money does to people. I had seen it twist kindness into greed, turn love into leverage, transform children into opportunists. And I knew my family well enough to know they would not see me, they would only see what I held. That's why I kept it quiet. I told no one. Not my daughter with her hurried excuses, not my son with his shallow promises, not even the neighbors who sometimes dropped off bread when they thought I was in need. Silence became my shield. Still, the weight of the secret was heavy. Each time my children spoke to me as though I were a burden, I thought of the numbers printed on that slip of paper. Each time I was overlooked, I thought of the account that now bore my name. Their neglect stung, but it also reminded me of something powerful. I no longer had to depend on anyone. I no longer had to beg for crumbs of attention. The irony burned. On Christmas Eve, as they left me alone in a house filled with memories, they believed I had nothing. They pitied me in their absence, convinced they were leaving me behind with only scraps. But I was sitting on a truth big enough to buy not just comfort, but entire streets. That was the moment the spark lit inside me. Their absence didn't weaken me, it clarified me. It showed me who they really were, and it showed me who I could become. The winnings weren't just about money, they were about choice. For the first time in years, I had the choice to rewrite the story. I could build something beyond their neglect. I could create a legacy not out of desperation but out of power. As I stared at the tree that night, lights blinking like tiny reminders of possibility, I whispered to myself, they left me alone at Christmas, but maybe that's the greatest gift they could have given me. Because now, I can see clearly, and in that clarity, the plan began to form. Slowly, quietly, like embers catching fire, an idea took shape that would turn their indifference into the stage for my rebirth. Tell me, have you ever carried a secret so powerful that it burned inside you, waiting for the right moment to ignite your entire life into something new? The Christmas night grew heavier with every tick of the clock. Outside, carolers' voices drifted faintly through the cold air, their harmonies threading through the cracks of my windows like echoes of a world I was no longer part of. Inside, my house was filled with the ghost of laughter that once had no end. I could still picture the children running around the tree in their pajamas, tearing through wrapping paper, squealing at dolls and toy trains. I could still hear my late husband's deep voice reading verses before dinner, his hand steady on the Bible that now sat untouched on the shelf. The silence pressed against me until I thought I would break. I sat at the table long after the candles burned low. The wax had pooled and hardened into uneven shapes, as though even the flames had grown tired of waiting. I looked at the plates, at the food I had prepared with such care. The roasted chicken sat uneaten, its skin crisp but cooling, the cider turning flat in its glass. I wanted to pack it away, but some stubborn part of me refused. To put the food back would be admitting defeat. Instead, I let it sit there untouched, as if their chairs were only temporarily empty, as if, any moment, the front door might swing open and my children would rush in shouting, "We're here!" But the door never opened. Midnight arrived, then passed, and I was left with the bitter truth. They had chosen not to be there. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't a mix-up. It was a decision. The hurt was sharp, sharper than anything I had felt in years. It cut deeper than when I had worked 3 jobs to keep the lights on while my husband battled illness. It burned more than the cold nights when I had gone without food so my children could eat. Because this pain wasn't born of hardship, it was born of choice. My children had chosen to leave me alone. I pressed my hand to my chest, the small locket with the hidden ticket inside pressing against my skin. I thought about telling them. I thought about calling and saying, "Do you know what I've won? Do you realize who I am now?" Maybe then they would come running. Maybe then they would remember me. But the thought made me sick. If their love could only be purchased with fortune, was it love at all? So I stayed silent. I stayed with my pain, letting it wash over me like a tide that would either drown me or cleanse me. And in that silence, something shifted. The bitterness, the humiliation, the deep loneliness, it all condensed into a single truth. I no longer needed to beg for love that came only in fragments. I realized that night that family is not always blood. Sometimes family is the neighbor who brings you cookies, or the nurse who smiles when she checks your blood pressure, or even the stranger who holds the door open for you at the store. Sometimes family is anyone who sees you as more than a burden. And if my children couldn't see me, then I would see myself. If they refused to value me, then I would create value so undeniable it would echo louder than their silence. I walked to the window and looked out at the street. Snow had begun to fall, coating the sidewalks in a soft white glow. Each flake felt like a clean slate, a chance to begin again. And as I stood there, watching the block I had lived on for decades, the thought struck me. What if this wasn't the end of my story? What if it was only the beginning? The winnings weren't just money, they were possibility. I could keep waiting for my children to remember me, or I could use what I had been given to carve out a new existence. One where loneliness was no longer the rule, but the exception. That night, I whispered to myself a promise. They may have left me alone at Christmas, but they will one day walk down this very street and see that the woman they abandoned built an empire from the ashes of their neglect. Tell me, if the people you loved most chose absence over you, would you still fight for their love? Or would you finally turn the page and write your story without them? When the morning after Christmas arrived, I no longer felt the sting of humiliation in the same way. The ache was still there, but it had hardened into something else: resolve. Their absence had carved a hollow in me, but inside that hollow, a seed had been planted, and with every tick of the clock that seed began to grow. I didn't want pity. I didn't want their sudden change of heart. I wanted dignity, and I wanted freedom. I pulled the locket from my neck, the one that held the tiny folded ticket inside, and laid it on the table. The silence of the house made my decision sound louder in my own head. It was time to act. No more waiting, no more hoping for recognition that never came. I had the power to change everything, and I would do it in secret. The first step was finding the right people to help me. I made an appointment with an attorney, one whose name I had found scribbled on a pamphlet tucked between junk mail. He specialized in property law, and when I walked into his office, I could tell by the way he looked at me that he expected little. Just another old woman with too many questions and not enough money. His expression changed, though, when I placed the papers from the lottery office on his desk. His eyebrows shot up, his voice lost its patronizing lilt, and suddenly, he was speaking to me with respect. I want to buy, I said firmly. Not one house, not one shop. I want the block. His pen paused mid-air. The entire block? Yes, quietly. No one must know it's me. From there, the plan took on a life of its own. The block where I had lived for 40 years, the one with cracked sidewalks and aging houses, was slowly, piece by piece, transferred into my name. Some sales were easy, families eager to move closer to the city. Others took patience, months of negotiation, sometimes even a little overpaying to win trust. But every signature that slid across the paper, every set of keys that landed in my hand, felt like another stone laid in the foundation of my new life. I didn't tell a soul. To the outside world, I was still the old woman who lived quietly in the corner house, baking cookies and nodding politely to neighbors. But behind closed doors, I was orchestrating a transformation. The block was becoming mine, house by house, deed by deed. I remember walking down the street one evening after the final purchase went through. The lampposts glowed dimly, the snow crunched beneath my boots, and I looked at every house with a strange mixture of awe and satisfaction. These weren't just buildings. They were proof that I had not been erased. Proof that I could still build, still create, still matter. And the sweetest part of it all, my children didn't know. They thought I was sitting at home, lonely and powerless. They pitied me when they bothered to think of me at all. But I carried in my heart the knowledge that I was no longer invisible. I was the quiet owner of the very block they had once played on as children. The attorney suggested renovations, improvements to raise the value. At first, I hesitated. What did I need with more money? But then I realized it wasn't about the money. It was about impact. I could restore the block, make it a place where people wanted to live, where families felt safe, where joy replaced neglect. And so I did. New paint on the houses, gardens planted in the yards, fences mended where they had sagged for years. Slowly, the block came alive again. Not just on paper, but in reality. Each project I funded, each wall repaired, was a declaration. I am not forgotten. I am not powerless. I am the architect of my own rebirth. And all the while, I stayed silent. I didn't brag. I didn't post announcements. I let the work speak for itself. Because one day, I knew, the truth would rise in a way no one could ignore. One day, The very people who left me alone at Christmas would walk these streets and realize they didn't just abandon an old woman, they abandoned the owner of everything they saw. Tell me, if you had the chance to transform the very ground of your pain into the foundation of your strength, would you reveal it right away? Or would you let silence sharpen the impact until the truth stunned everyone who doubted you? It was almost spring when they finally came back into my life, as if nothing had happened. My daughter arrived first, unannounced, carrying a smile too bright to be real. She knocked softly on the door, the same door she had ignored for months, and when I opened it, she spoke as if no time had passed. "Hi, Mom. Thought I'd check on you." Behind her words, I could hear the hollow ring of guilt masked as cheer. A week later, my son appeared. No gifts, no apologies, just a nervous laugh, and the same line he had always used when he wanted something. "Hey, Mom, how have you been?" His eyes darted around the living room, landing on the fresh paint, the new curtains, the polished floors. "The place looks different," he muttered, suspicion prickling his tone. I said nothing at first. I let them sit in their discomfort, sipping the tea I poured, watching them exchange uneasy glances. It was clear they hadn't come for me. They had come because word had begun to spread. Whispers about the old block being bought up. Rumors of a silent investor transforming the neighborhood. My children, so inattentive for so long, had suddenly remembered I existed. It didn't take long before the questions slipped out. "Mom, do you know anything about what's happening on this street?" My daughter asked carefully. "We heard someone bought the Johnsons' house, and the Millers, and even that old shop on the corner. Do you know who it is?" I smiled faintly, stirring my tea. "Yes," I said simply. Their eyes widened. My son leaned forward. "Who? Do you know them?" I set the spoon down gently and looked them both in the eyes. "You're looking at her." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. My daughter's jaw dropped. My son's face twisted in disbelief. "What do you mean?" he stammered. I said, my voice steady. "While you were too busy to remember me on Christmas, I was buying the very ground you used to play on. This block belongs to me now. Every house, every shop, every brick." The color drained from their faces. My son laughed nervously, as though he could dismiss my words as nonsense. "Mom, come on. You don't have that kind of money." I leaned back, folding my hands in my lap. "Do you remember the lottery ticket I bought at the corner store? The one I never mentioned? That ticket was worth more than you ever imagined. Enough to buy this block. Enough to build a new life where your absence no longer defines me." My daughter's eyes welled with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse, they were tears of shock. My son, on the other hand, grew angry. "Why didn't you tell us? We could have helped you." "We could have, you could have what?" I interrupted sharply. "Taken control? Decided for me how to spend it? Left behind my back?" "No, I kept it quiet because money doesn't change hearts, it reveals them. And I wanted to see yours clearly." Their silence was louder than any denial. In that moment, they realized the truth. The woman they had dismissed, forgotten, and left behind had built something greater than they could comprehend. The confrontation ended not with shouting but with distance. They left that day slower than they had arrived, the weight of their own choices pressing down on them. And as I watched them walk away, I didn't feel the bitterness I had expected. I felt power, not the kind that crushes others, but the kind that comes from finally being seen for who you are, not for what others think you lack. Neighbors soon confirmed what my children now knew. They waved at me as I walked down the street, thanking me for the repairs, for the gardens, for the safety that had returned to our block. They didn't care about the number on the ticket. They cared about the difference they could see with their own eyes. And for the first time in years, I felt a strange kind of family among strangers. My children would never see me the same again. Whether they chose to respect me or resent me was up to them. But I had already won, not because of the money, but because I had turned their neglect into a foundation of strength. Tell me, if the very people who once overlooked you suddenly discovered you had built an empire in silence, would you let them back in, or would you let them live with the weight of what they chose to abandon? The block looked different now. Not just the houses freshly painted in warm tones, or the gardens that bloomed where weeds once reigned. The air itself felt lighter, alive with the Laughter of children playing on sidewalks that had once been cracked and abandoned. Families gathered on porches, neighbors shared stories at dusk, and the hum of life returned to a place that had nearly been forgotten. And at the center of it all, quietly, without ceremony, was me. I would walk the street in the evenings, cane tapping lightly against the pavement, and smile at the way people waved. Some knew the truth that the old woman on the corner had bought the block with winnings she never boasted about. Others only saw the changes and felt gratitude, never questioning who was behind them. Either way, for the first time in years, I felt visible. Not because my children had finally remembered me, but because I had remembered myself. The irony was not lost on me. On Christmas Eve, I had been invisible, sitting at a table no one came to. Months later, I had become the unseen force shaping an entire community. But what mattered most wasn't the power or the wealth, it was the freedom. Freedom to make choices without begging for approval. Freedom to use what I had been given not as a chain but as a key. And yet, in quiet moments, my heart still ached. I thought of my son, my daughter, of the years I had poured into raising them. I thought of Christmas mornings when their joy had been my only gift, when their small arms around my neck had been all the wealth I could ever want. That memory cut deeper than any neglect they had shown me as adults. Love, once pure, had been replaced with absence, and no amount of property deeds could erase that wound. They visited occasionally now, tentative, cautious. Their voices softened, their words careful, as though they were speaking to someone they no longer understood. They asked about the houses, about the repairs, about the future. Rarely did they ask about me, and I learned to let their questions roll off my back because I no longer sought their validation. My worth wasn't tethered to their recognition. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the street in gold, I sat on my porch with a cup of tea. A neighbor's child ran past, laughing, clutching a balloon that nearly escaped into the sky. The sound filled me with something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. Not the fragile peace of pretending everything was fine, but the sturdy peace of knowing I had chosen my path, built it with my own hands, and stood tall within it. I touched a locket around my neck, no longer hiding the ticket but wearing it as a reminder, not of luck, but of transformation. The numbers on that slip of paper had changed more than my bank account. They had changed the way I saw myself. I was not a burden. I was not forgotten. I was the woman who turned neglect into renewal, loneliness into legacy. And still, the question lingers in my heart, one I may never fully answer. Do I forgive my children for leaving me at that table, or do I let the silence remain as the consequence of their choice? Forgiveness is heavy, and perhaps it belongs to another chapter of my story. For now, I walk freely on streets that are mine, knowing that even if they never see me the way they once did, I have learned to see myself more clearly than ever before. So I leave you with this. If the people who abandoned you returned only after you had built something greater than they could imagine, would you open your door wide, or would you let them stand outside, forever staring at the life they chose to miss?